The purpose of a business is the reason why it exists, why it's created, and what it's there to do. Purpose is more than just producing returns for shareholders and profit. The purpose of a business is to produce solutions that we as individuals and society and the natural world face. It's there to produce profitable solutions because it's not about philanthropy, it's about hard-nosed business and viable business practice. And the way in which I define the purpose of a business is to produce profitable solutions for the problems of people and planet. And in the process, it produces profits, but profits are not per se the purpose of business. Furthermore, business should not profit from producing problems for people or planet. A purpose is precise, it's not woolly. It's not purely descriptive of what a firm does or aspirational in terms of saving the world. It's about what problems a business is solving, how it's solving those problems, for whom it's solving problems, when it's going to solve those problems, and why that business is particularly well suited to solving those problems. The most purposeful businesses are the ones that know best now how to respond to the crisis. It's a way of establishing the response that companies should be making based on their values and their principles and their culture that derives from their corporate purpose. Those values and principles determine the hard trade-offs that companies and investors need to make in the difficult current circumstances. Trade-offs between their customers and their employees, between their societies and their investors, the way in which they should implement those processes to fulfill their values and purposes. What we're observing is a change in people's attitudes and priorities, and a change in the preferences on the parts of customers of businesses and also of their employees. And what the purpose of a business does is to determine how companies are best able to respond to those changing circumstances and the changing priorities and preferences that their employees and customers will have. It's essentially a way of determining the value proposition that companies will be able to put forward as they move into their next phase of their activities. What are they best there suited to do once the coronavirus begins to recede? The relationship between business purpose, the models of business, and their strategy is illustrated by what is currently happening in terms of how business is trying to respond to the pandemic crisis. Because the purposes of businesses are their guiding star, the direction of travel of business over the long term. Not only determines short-term and medium-term strategies, it determines where the company should be going over the long term. And out of that notion of the long-term objective come the shorter-term or medium-term strategies of companies as to what they should be doing, for example, over the next 3 to 5 years. And what's important about the purpose in terms of guiding those shorter-term strategic objectives is that that then provides the basis on which companies can create a meaningful value proposition, something to which they can go to their shareholders and raise financing from them to fund their business. There have been profound changes that have gone on over the last year or so in how businesses are considering their social or environmental purposes. We've had statements by institutional investors such as BlackRock and its CEO and president Larry Fink about the purposes of business. We've had the Business Roundtable in August of 2019 restating its purpose as being beyond just shareholder primacy. We've had the Financial Times putting forward its new agenda, Capitalism, Time for Reset. We've had the World Economic Forum and its declaration of purpose of the company in the fourth industrial revolution. Now, all of that is emphasizing the growing significance that companies and investors recognize in the importance of companies having purpose. And in particular, what has been at the forefront of people's minds until very recently has been the significance of the environment, climate change, and carbon emissions. And there's been a great deal of pressure that has come from the institutional investment community on companies, from society at large, from governments, for companies to take more account of their environmental impact, because this has been perceived to be an existential threat for both the world and for business itself. But now there's an even more immediate threat that business and the world perceives. And that comes from the pandemic panic that we're currently going through, which is raising an existential threat to the health and survival of people and societies. And that is then shifting the emphasis of companies and investors and society beyond just a focus on the environment to a focus on social issues as well. The British Academy, which is the UK National Academy of the Humanities and the Social Sciences, has undertaken a major program of research on the future of the corporation, in which they're looking at how, over the coming years, business needs to adapt to address the environmental, social, and political challenges it faces, as well as to take advantage of the remarkable technological advances that are in progress. And in November of 2019, the British Academy produced its second report on the future of the corporation, in which it set out the principles of purposeful business, by which it put forward the notion as to how business can best change to implement the notion of becoming more purposeful. And it described 8 principles around which those reforms should take place. Those 8 principles were in terms of law, in particular corporate law and regulation, on ownership of companies and their governance, their corporate governance, on the measurement of what companies do and the metrics by which they're measured, and their performance, how one should measure the performance of companies. And they also included the way in which companies finance their activities and the investments that they undertake. Now, those 8 principles of law, regulation, ownership, governance, measurement, performance, finance, and investment are the basis on which we believe that a fundamental reform of business can and should take place over the coming decades. And what we believe is required in terms of those reforms is a focus of each of them on the purposes of business, that law should be about the duties of directors to uphold their corporate purposes, not simply reflect the interests of their shareholders, that regulation should be purposeful regulation that helps to align the purposes of companies with the social interest in those companies that are performing particularly important social functions. That ownership should not just be about the rights of shareholders, but about the responsibilities of owners in promoting corporate purposes. That corporate governance is about aligning management interests, not just with those of their shareholders, but with the delivery of companies' purposes. That measurement is about not just measuring the financial performance of companies, but their performance in relation to their human assets, their social assets, and the natural world. And that performance is not just about profits in terms of the earnings of investors, but the extent to which companies are fulfilling their purposes. Finance is not just about promoting benefits for investors, but how one ensures that companies are able to raise the type of finance that they need over the long term to promote their purposes. And investment is not just about investing in assets to maximize the value of shareholder interest, but working in partnership with different organizations in the public and the private sector in terms of ensuring that the necessary resources for delivering purposes are in place. The board of a company is central to the development and delivery of a company purpose. And we have developed a framework by which we believe that we can help boards of companies to ensure that purpose is firmly embedded in their organizations and to stimulate thinking and discussion around purpose within their companies. That framework we use the acronym of SCORE for. And SCORE stands firstly for the notion of simplification, simplifying what one means by a corporate purpose. The journey that Novo Nordisk, the Danish pharmaceutical company, went through in terms of defining its purpose is an illustration of that, when it moved from a notion of its purpose being about producing insulin to a recognition that its purpose was about helping to eradicate diabetes in the world. The second element of the framework, C, is for connect, to connect the purpose of a company with its corporate strategy, its values, and its principles, and ensure that the purpose is fully embedded throughout the organization. That should be led from the top, from the board, and it should be articulated as part of the way in which the business works from the board down to the shop floor. O in SCORE stands for ownership, the notion that there should be ownership of the purpose throughout the business, including by the owners of the business itself. So the example of Novo Nordisk, the Danish pharmaceutical company, is a good illustration of the importance of ownership. It is a company that is listed on the Danish and the New York Stock Exchanges and actively traded, but it has an owner in the form of the Novo Nordisk Foundation, which upholds that corporate purpose and ensures that it endures beyond the life of a single board and is embedded in the long term as an intergenerational proposition of the company. But ownership should not just be in the hands of the investors and the shareholders, but also owned by everyone throughout the organization. And part of that is to ensure that there are the right ways of measuring performance and incentivizing. And that's where the fourth element comes in, namely the R for reward. That is to say that companies should measure their performance, against their purposes and link the promotion and remuneration of people throughout the organization to the delivery of that corporate purpose. And finally, E stands for exemplify, to demonstrate how the company is really living its purpose, and to have narratives that provide a straightforward and simple way of communicating its success in terms of delivering on its corporate purpose.